Processing, processing, loading. I passed! Yay! Hi, I'm Don from Don Drones On. I was absolutely thrilled the other day to pass my new 2019 Canadian Drone Pilot Basic Operations exam. But I'll tell you, it was not easy. So what I thought I'd do is put together this study guide so that you could have your yay moment just like I did. Let's get into it. Okay, let's go through and understand what you're going to be facing when you sit down and take the exam. It is an online exam, both the basic operations exam and the advanced operations exam. I'm going to be talking exclusively around the basic operations, but just for interest, here's the information for the advanced one. Both of the exams are online. They're open book, which means you're free to access reference material, which is cool. I do have 4 very specific things that you definitely want to have open on your desktop when you take the exam. You must do it on your own with no help from any other person. And you can't copy or remove any portion of the text of the exam when you are finished. So you won't see any sample questions here, and the government doesn't offer any sample questions either. There are 35 multiple choice questions. In the advanced there's more. And you have a time limit of 90 minutes, so an hour and a half, roughly 3 minutes per question. I did it in 60 minutes, including reviewing all my answers. So, to make sure that they were all correct. Now, as I say that, but I only got 77% of them correct. It's a passing grade. You only need 65% or 23 of those 35 questions correct in order to pass. It's $10 per attempt at the exam, and you can rewrite the exam as many times as you want until you pass it. You do have to wait 24 hours between each rewrite of the exam. Each time you take the exam, though, you should expect the questions and even the order of the choices within the questions to be different each time you take that exam. It's not going to be the same set of questions each time. One thing that's cool is that you do receive the results immediately after completing the exam. So you can have your yay moment as soon as you're finished. You do get an indication of any incorrect answers you did during the exam. You don't get the actual question you got wrong, but they tell you the knowledge area. And I'll talk to you a lot about these knowledge areas as we go into this video. Here are the 4 documents that I strongly recommend you have open on your desktop when you take the exam. The first 2 are directly related to drones. The second 2 are generic aviation documents. And believe it or not, probably half the exam is about generic aviation things, nothing to do with drones, drone safety, drone flying, anything like that. So it's important to have those open as well so that you can have quick access to these when you're trying to find the answers. So the first one that I recommend you have open, it's a long, complicated name, but basically this is the new Canadian regulations for drone operation in Canada, the June 1st, 2019 regulations. When you open this document, you'll probably say, what the heck? Don's obviously made a mistake. This is all just gibberish and amendments and penalties and all sorts, and I'm not going to read this. Well, if you get down around here, you'll start to see that the real regulations start, and they're all the things that have these 900 numbers in front of them. Most of them are actually 901. So here's the real regulations in that document. Okay, so 901.02, no person shall operate, blah, blah, blah. All right, that's what you need to zero in on. Don't worry, when you first open this document, it won't look real. The second document I recommend you have open is called the Knowledge Requirements document for pilots of RPAs. Why would you have this open? It doesn't have any answers in it. Well, it has strange little tips if you go through it that you will not find anywhere else. It's weird. For example, all the regulations that exist around drones in Canada are related to flying your drone outside, obviously. But they don't apply to inside, like if you're inside a building, or if you're, okay, this might sound strange, but there was a question about this, they don't apply if you're flying underground. And the only place that's ever mentioned is in this knowledge requirements document. So it's useful. I used this document extensively to prepare this video. These other two documents are reference manuals, and they are hundreds of pages long each, about aviation in Canada, where you can find radio frequencies and what to do when you are landing at, in Montreal. Unbelievable detail in here, really good. And you might not think it's important now, but you'll find that at least half the questions in the exam have nothing to do with drones, and you might have to access these documents to find the information that you need. So have these 4 documents open on your desktop, and once again, the links are in the description below the video. Let's go through these fundamental rules. So they break down into 3 different categories, whether you're flying basic operations, which is what 90% of recreational flyers will be doing, more advanced operations, or specialized work that requires a Special Flight Operations Certificate, or an SFOC. So small drones in Canada are defined as those drones that are between 250 grams and 25 kilos. If you're below that, the rules don't apply. If you're over 25 kilos, you must be in an SFOC situation. Your drone has to be registered by Transport Canada and marked with a registration number. For basic operations, you can be flying any drone. And again, when I say drone, that includes radio-controlled aircraft as well. And that can be homemade stuff without a serial number or anything like that. All of these things can be flown. But if you're flying advanced operations, only drones that are on an approved list that's on the Transport Canada site can you be flying these advanced operations. There's only 33 drones as of this date that are on that approved list. Hopefully they'll have more later. In terms of the pilot, you need to be certified, which means writing and passing the exam that you're studying for today. There's one for basic operations and there's another one for advanced operations. If you're flying advanced operations, you also have to pass a flight review in person with a real live flight review instructor who can evaluate your capability. For basic operations, you have to be at least 14 years old or flying under the direct supervision of a certified pilot. For advanced, 16 years old. In all cases, and you absolutely must know this, you have to be fit to fly. And that means, amongst other things, no alcohol or drugs within 12 hours of your flying. And you can't be subject to fatigue either. And we'll get into this one a little later. Visual line of sight is fundamental to all of the drone rules. You must maintain visual line of sight at all times. If you don't have visual line of sight, your only backup is to have a visual observer who has been designated in advance to be the one to keep your drone in sight. And for that reason, if you're flying with FPV or first person view goggles, you must have a visual observer when you're doing that. If you're flying at night, again, visual line of sight is required, but in this case you're looking for the lights on the drone and you have to be able to see those. If you're flying under an SFOC, visual line of sight is not always required. Let's review where you can fly under the various forms of operation. And again, this material is consolidated here. It's the only place where you'll see all of this information in one spot. You can take a screenshot of it for when you're taking the exam, or if you'd like, you can purchase it from me via the link in the description below. So, proximity to airports and controlled airspace. You have to be 5.6 kilometers away from airports, you have to be 1.9 kilometers away from heliports, and you cannot be in controlled airspace. And controlled airspace is defined on navigation maps, and if your drone is an advanced drone like a DJI drone, it will tell you if you're in controlled airspace and prevent you from flying there. If you have an advanced operations certificate, you can fly in these environments with air traffic control permission. Same with the SFOC. Proximity to people. Now, under basic operations, you have to be at least 30 meters or 100 feet away from anyone who's not in your flight crew. So the pilot, visual observer, that kind of thing. And you cannot fly over people under any circumstances. If you have your advanced operations certificate, you can fly closer and you can fly over people. Advertised events are actually rather interesting because you're not allowed to fly over them under either the basic operations or the advanced operations. You have to have an SFOC from Transport Canada in order to fly over them. And by advertised events, Transport Canada means any event that is publicly advertised anywhere. So in the newspaper, on a website, in Facebook, nailed on the side of a telephone pole, doesn't matter. If your kid's having their soccer tournament, you can't fly over it. And that includes parades, concerts, sporting events, any of that stuff, not allowed. Maximum altitude, under the new rules, you can fly up to 122 meters or 400 feet. But here's a subtlety that's not really brought out too clearly in the rules. If you are flying over buildings, you can only be 30 meters above the ground, or 100 feet. And that applies if you are within 61 meters of those buildings. So if you're close to a building, they want you to be flying low, presumably so that if you lose control, you're not going to go right through the roof. Here's another one. This is not explicitly stated in the regulations, but it's on the Parks Canada site. And Parks Canada controls national parks, historical sites like the Rideau Canal, places like that. You are not allowed to fly over any Parks Canada facility or land without the prior agreement with Parks Canada. And again, even if you have an SFOC, you need to have that SFOC approved by an authorized representative for either the event or the site. So there's where you can fly. Nice consolidated view. So if you've got all that figured out, you're about halfway there. As you can see on this chart, there's 8 knowledge areas that Transport Canada expects you to understand in order to pass the exam. And those 8 areas have questions assigned to them in this sort of quantity. So 14 questions are out of the air law, air traffic rules and procedures, which is where most of the drone stuff is. But then there's 2 questions from airframes, 2 from human factors, and so forth. So what we're going to do is go through each of these knowledge areas so that you can understand what is required in each of those in order to pass the test, because so much of it has nothing to do with drones. First area is called Air Law, Air Traffic Rules and Procedures. There's 2 pages of stuff on this. And up in the top corner, by the way, I've indicated the number of questions that apply to this particular knowledge area. So the things you need to know in this one there's a lot of terminology questions. So defining remotely piloted aircrafts or RPA, small RPA, which is basically the size range in question here, 250 grams to 25 kilograms, and RPAS, which is remotely piloted aircraft systems, which is basically your drone plus the control unit and display and wires and all that stuff. And then there's aviation terms you need to know, like aerodrome, airport, heliport, Class C airspace, Class F airspace, and so forth. You need to look these up and figure them all out. By the way, an aerodrome is simply the generic term for a place where an airplane or an aircraft can land or take off. So for each of these knowledge areas, what I've indicated over here is the best reference for you to look them up and understand them, either in advance, which would be best, or during the exam. So CAR stands for those drone civil aviation regulation rules, and AIM is the Aeronautical Information Manual. In the case of the CAR manual, for many of them, what I've done is given you the exact rule that pertains to that particular topic. All right, so you should know all the drone registration requirements. You need to know all that stuff about visual line of sight and restrictions around flying around airports. You also need to know that you can't fly around a designated emergency area or forest fires or things like that. And that all makes sense, of course, because there could be emergency helicopters flying to and from, and you sure as heck don't want to get in the way of that. And of course, you need to know the flight restrictions around people and advertised events, which are those soccer tournaments that you want to film, and structures. Another topic that's kind of slid in there on rules 22 and 43 are around payload restrictions. So you can't fly with a squirrel on board, and you can't carry around firecrackers or anything flammable and stuff like that, other than fuel, obviously. And probably a pretty fundamental thing is that you must give way or yield to any manned aircraft. So if you're in the way, you get out of the way. So a few more things in this category. There are some restrictions that are defined in rule number 37 about driving a vehicle or a boat or even an airplane for that matter while piloting your drone. Bottom line is you can't do that. You also cannot be a visual observer if you're driving a vehicle or say driving a boat. You have to be dedicated to that task. And we've talked about FPV goggles and flying at night. And you need to be aware of all the flight conditions requiring advanced operations so that you don't accidentally go into that sort of zone of flying if you have only your basic operations certificate. Same thing with an SFOC. You also need to know, and it's defined in Rule 49, what kind of accidents and incidents you are expected to report to Transport Canada. Bottom line for Section 01, know the car rules inside out. Knowledge area number 2 is basically about your drone itself, physical elements of your drone. And there's 2 questions from the pool of questions they have that will be directed your way when you do the exam that cover this kind of requirement. So number 1 is requirements for access to manufacturers' operating manuals and instruction manuals. So there's 2 rules around that, number 30 and 31. I interpret operating manuals as based on, believe it or not, the AIM document, that an operating manual is something that's specific to your aircraft itself, that serial numbered item itself, any strange peculiarities about it, operating restrictions and things like that, as opposed to an instruction manual that is the generic instructions for that model of thing. You're supposed to have access to the instruction manual, but you're supposed to have an operating manual that's specific to your device on hand at all times. So for most people in a recreational mode, you're okay here doing what you would do naturally. You also need to know parts of the airframe, environmental factors that can affect equipment and systems like temperature. You do need to know about lithium-ion batteries and any rules about the transportation of those. That's kind of tricky to look up. Types of motors, believe it or not, they're going to ask you questions that could cover that, or propellers, how a compass works, and altimeters, airspeed, inertia, whatever this IMU thing is, I can't even remember. All of these things are subjects that are listed in the knowledge requirements that you may want to look up either in advance or probably most practically just be prepared to Google them or look in the particular documents at the time. Knowledge area number 3 is human factors, and there's 2 questions that you'll be given in this area. The most fundamental ones are all around the use of alcohol and drugs and being too tired to fly. So they're all encompassed in rule number 19. I suggest you read that rule, know it inside out, and be prepared to answer the question, where the magic answer is usually 12 hours. There's a couple other areas in this human factors knowledge area that you should be aware of, and that's about scanning techniques that visual observers should understand. And I'm not sure a specific source in any of the manuals that I saw that cover this topic, but it is listed in the knowledge requirements, so don't be surprised if something about that comes up. Another thing that's listed in the knowledge requirement is understanding what's called perspective illusion with distant aircraft. It's not too hard to understand. It's basically being able to figure out whether a plane is coming towards you or going away from you. So for this one, certainly know your car number 19 about fitness to fly, and otherwise probably being ready and able to Google something would do you best. Knowledge area number 4 is meteorology, or weather, basically, and there's 2 questions that'll come up here. I was stunned because I was asked 2 questions about the types of clouds there are, And it was like, why am I being asked this? And how is it possibly going to help me when I'm flying my drone to be able to look in the sky and say, oh, it's a cirrus cloud. Thank goodness for that. But there you go. Don't waste time like I did wondering why. Just answer the question and get on with it. Now, there is an important area in the rules around weather conditions, particularly icing conditions. You're not allowed to fly if it's either it is or it could potentially have conditions that will cause ice to form on your aircraft. And you're not allowed to fly if there's literally any snow on your drone. That's what the rule is. Not judging, just saying. And in the AIM document, it does provide some information about the impact of wind and temperature and precipitation of all kinds on flight. Oh, and you should also know about the visual line of sight impact of things like fog or snow. And I think if you've ever been outside, you can probably answer these questions fairly readily. They're at least the one that I was offered didn't sound too difficult. Hopefully I got it right. Knowledge area number 5 is navigation, and there's 4 questions that will come up around here. And again, you might be surprised at the sorts of things they ask, but don't worry about it. Just get on and answer those questions. So the first one is actually quite important, and it ties to regulations number 27 and 33. I'm not sure which one is which, but they basically are saying in the regulations, and it makes sense, that before you fly, you should perform what they term a site survey, which basically means know what's going on around you before you take off. So know if there's airports, you probably will know that. Know if there's hazards like cell towers or power lines and things like that. Be aware of any prohibited areas, including potentially, I'll call them temporary prohibited areas like accident sites. And don't take off if any of that stuff is going to in any way interact with your flight. So that's pretty important, and you may be asked a question in that area. You will also be asked questions about reading maps. So understanding what scales are and what standard scales are on aviation maps. They're listed in the AIM manual. How to read the elevation on a map. Why you'd need to know that, I don't know, but there you go. You're asked that question, or I did anyway. Symbols on the map, like airports and things like that. And you need to understand some basic stuff about latitude and longitude. So if you don't know these things already, I suggest you Google them or read up on some basic stuff about understanding how maps are used and so on. Oh, and of course the most important thing when you're flying a drone is to know what time it is in London, England, wherever you are. I'm just kidding again, but I got a question about time zone conversion. Very strange. I can sort of understand it, but still strange. And last but not least, in the knowledge requirements, it mentions that you should be aware of sources of RF interference, both for your connection between your control unit and your drone, as well as GPS, things that could interfere with your GPS. All right, so if that question comes up, you might need to Google it if it's not immediately obvious. Knowledge area number 6 is flight operations, and a lot of drone specific, or at least drone regulation specific, requirements in this area. These are more of the administrative things around flying your drone. Things like knowing who's in charge. So if you have a pilot and a visual observer, the pilot is always in charge. All right? They have the cool hat after all. Second thing is definitions like the definition of a visual observer, what their role is, and what restrictions there are around visual observers. I mentioned one earlier, that the visual observer can't be driving a boat, for example. They're allowed on the boat, but they can't be flying the boat or driving the boat. You are expected to have written procedures on your person, or nearby anyway, for both normal procedures and emergency procedures associated with your flight. They are defined in Rule 23, and you may want to read up on that. And similarly, you're expected to have written down pre-flight procedures, like a checklist sort of thing of what you go over, and you're expected to understand the requirements associated with that. They're in rules 24 and 28. I mentioned before the requirement to have access to operating manuals if you have a manual that's specific for your device, and instruction manual for all you have to have for instruction manual is have reasonably easy access to it, so you don't have to carry that one in your back pocket. You're also expected to have records and keep records of all sorts of stuff, including when you fly your drone, who flew your drone, aircraft modifications you might have made, like changing propellers and things like that, with dates and times and all the rest of that. Those are outlined in Rule 48. Just saying, you're expected to do that. Knowledge area number 7 is reasonable, but very peculiar. You're expected to understand Bernoulli's principle, which of course is the fundamental reason why any of this stuff works in terms of lift, how it relates to airfoils. You might be asked to define certain parts of an airfoil, and principles like lift and drag and center of gravity, turbulence and laminar flow. All of these things you're expected, according to the knowledge requirements document, you're expected to know this stuff. So when I hit it, I know for some of those things I definitely needed to Google it, and well, again, I think I got it right, but just don't be surprised if this sort of stuff comes up. 2 questions come up in the knowledge area number 7. Last but not least is knowledge area number 8, radio telephony. And again, in my humble opinion, this is entirely outside the scope of what you're allowed to do in basic operations, but the knowledge requirements say that you're expected to know this stuff, and they'll ask 4 questions. And I can tell you, I definitely got questions in this area, and each and every one of them I said, hang on, I shouldn't be doing this. So for example, you're expected to know where aviation radio frequencies are defined, and that's in the AIM. In fact, most of this stuff is in the AIM. That's the Aeronautical Information Manual, that 424-page Bible of everything aviation. You're expected to know how to communicate by radio with air traffic control. Again, I'm supposed to stay out of air control areas as a basic operator, but there you go. You're expected to know how to communicate with them. And you're also supposed to know how to communicate with air traffic control if you happen to lose contact with them when you're flying over their airport, which you're not supposed to do. So there you go. You're supposed to know that. You're also, this one's actually reasonable. You are expected to know under what circumstances you are to report an incident or even a potential incident where your drone could fly into a prohibited area out of your control. And I also got at least one question in I would call them generic aviation rules, regulations, and procedures. And the only place I could find the answer is in the full regulations for Canadian aviation, the full car. Strange but true. So those are the areas or the topics that you need to know in area number 8, radio telephony. So there you have it. Those are the 8 areas of knowledge that you're expected according to the knowledge requirements document. Air law, air traffic, airframes and power plants, human factors, meteorology, navigation, flight operations, theory of flight, radio telephony. And that's the distribution of questions across those, adding up to 35 multiple choice questions for your basic operations exam. That's it. That's all. You'll probably want to watch this a couple of times before taking your exam. So best wishes, good luck, and safe flying. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe below. It's Don Joyce here, signing off for now.